Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to BookTrek 2021. This is a 5-month mission I'm embarked on with a bunch of other booktubers where we're reading Star Trek fiction for the rest of 2021. We started with the original series, the novels of the original series, and now we've moved on to Star Trek The Next Generation. And we'll move on from here to Deep Space Nine, and then Voyager, and then Star Trek Enterprise. But Star Trek The Next Generation was the only one of those 5 that was going to be a real voyage of discovery for me, because it was the one weak spot in my wall-to-wall love of all things Star Trek. Here I am excluding all Kurtzman Star Trek, almost all Kurtzman Star Trek. I'm excluding basically the abomination that is Star Trek Discovery. That sort of ruined things for me in a way that the J.J. Abrams movies did not. Mainly because it looks to me, I've never got an absolutely clear answer to this question from anybody, including from people at Paramount. It looks to me like the Kurtzman-verse Star Trek, the Star Trek iterations, Lower Decks, Star Trek Discovery, obviously Star Trek Picard. It looks to me like those all take place in the Roddenberry universe, not the Kelvin timeline. Not the alternate universe in which the J.J. Abrams movies take place. As people tend to forget, the J.J. Abrams movies take place in an alternate reality. They aren't part of Star Trek continuity. They're a new Star Trek continuity. And as such, I was willing to go along with them. The first J.J. Abrams Star Trek movie is just about the dumbest movie of any kind that I have ever watched. Nothing, literally nothing in it makes any sense at all. There's a lot that doesn't make sense in the second J.J. Abrams movie and the third one, but the first one was my introduction to this alternate timeline, and there's nothing in it that makes any sense at all. I'm not talking about nitpicky things, CinemaSin things. I'm saying just sitting there watching, you're saying, what? 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 Over and over and over and over again. But I was okay with that. I was okay with that. I did not consider that to be a desecration of Star Trek, because it's not my Star Trek. That was my foremost reaction when that movie was over. Was, okay, well, but what about Mr. Spock? Mr. Spock isn't going back to my reality. He's not going back to the real Star Trek universe. So he goes into an alternate reality like he does so many times in the original series, but he doesn't return this time. He's just gone. And we're not returning. We're trapped in this mirror universe. We're not going back home. That was my first reaction, and that was a little bittersweet. But then after I lived with it for a bit, I realized, well, that makes this all safe. So that it ultimately doesn't matter to me how dumb this is, because it's not Star Trek. Not in one very fundamental sense is it Star Trek. It is a kind of Star Trek, but it's something that I don't have any emotional stakes in. Whereas Alex Kurtzman seems to be playing with the real Star Trek world. And even in a show that I tend to like, Star Trek Picard, I tend to like. I think about it a lot. And I think there's a lot of stuff in there that's gratuitous and stupid, and that was done by people who aren't Star Trek fans. Horrific torture porn, sadomasochistic gore fest, a nihilistic worldview, where there is no such thing as good unless it's connected to progressive political causes. But good doesn't exist other than that, and if a larger cause of good doesn't have those in it, it's not to be championed. It's not to be followed in any way. Who cares if you're going to wipe out all life in the universe if you're not going to hire diversely in your company? That kind of worldview, that kind of utterly 21st century social media nihilism is all over Star Trek Picard. There are large parts of Star Trek Picard that I love, but even I got sick of the cis-het white guy apologizing for everything he's ever done in his life, including saving the universe. Even I just rolled my eyes at gender fluidity swaps that come out of nowhere and violate established continuity. Even I, in Star Trek Picard, was stopped short by the gratuitous and vindictive murder and torture of beloved characters from the old show. It seemed to me that was not called for. Those things were not called. A character being graphically tortured on camera without us looking away at all. It seemed to me that those instances, whether it's Icheb or Hugh from the Borg, it seemed to me that those instances were not called for by the plot. I got the very strong sense that they were there for the showrunners to tell original fans, this is your place, make sure you remember it. I could be wrong. I'm definitely going to be rewatching Star Trek Picard for the rest of my life. That's not going to be true of Star Trek Discovery. The sooner that it is written out of continuity, the better for me, and yet that will never happen. Because if it were to ever happen or even be discussed, the executives who discuss it would be canceled. Their houses would be firebombed. Their children would be stalked at school. They already know that physically, just for their own physical safety, they can't disavow this weird abomination that they've created. Why did I get on that tangent? Oh, right. Because up until that point, up until the season finale of Star Trek Enterprise, I loved all of Star Trek except for The Next Generation, which it bugged me. Right from its premiere, just bugged me. And I heard pleas in its defense from all of its fans all through the 90s. And I listened to those pleas. I did. But every time I returned to the show and looked at it, all of my original objections just seemed strengthened. It seemed to be a very wooden, very managerial, very corporate culture manifestation of the bright, shining universe of Gene Roddenberry. And the characters didn't seem to me to be three-dimensional at all. There were hardly any moments that had the kind of emotional resonance that I could point to in dozens of moments in the original show's 3 seasons. And Star Trek The Next Generation went on for 7 seasons. Time has mellowed me. I am a wiser 28-year-old, and I am now able to see a lot of the points that the show's defenders were saying. One of which was the coherence of the bridge crew, the camaraderie of the bridge crew, the fact that they're all in it together, which I believe was an original idea of Gene Roddenberry's, but it's conveyed perfectly. At its best, it's wonderful. And also, I originally thought that the weird, almost X-Men-like diversity of backstories and character oddities and quirks and whatnot for the bridge crew of The Next Generation, I originally thought that was just pure fan service tokenism without any depth to it at all. But even if I was right about that originally, depth was subsequently added to almost all of these characters. And that was another point that Next Generation fans kept making to me. They kept saying, stop judging the show by the first 2 seasons. Judge it by all 7 seasons. Look how it grows. Look how it grows. Unfortunately, those fans pointed to a lot of things that were objections of mine. I have fans point out, there's one particular episode where the ship encounters a space boy, and it emits a telepathic signal that takes over Jean-Luc Picard and makes him relive the entire life of an ordinary man on another planet, so that we learn at the end that their memory will not be forgotten. And it's an extremely touching episode. It's extremely well done, but it has nothing to do with the Enterprise. It's an extremely touching episode because the showrunners gave Patrick Stewart a passably competent cast of co-stars to just do a little potted melodrama on his own. Want to come up here? Huh? Come on, baby. Sweet. There you go. There you go. And even that episode, the one that with that beautiful closing scene of Picard playing the piccolo as the shot draws away from the Enterprise, even that episode I had objections to for the same reason that I have objections to so much of what Star Trek The Next Generation did, which is that it should have had ramifications, and it didn't. Jean-Luc Picard has lived an entire other lifetime that he remembers in every detail. That would fundamentally change not only his relationship with everyone he knows, but also his command style. It would, in other words, in my opinion, invalidate him for command of a starship, much less the flagship of the Federation. Same thing with being completely co-opted by the Borg. Having his eye his right eye and half of the right side of his skull removed, having one of his arms replaced, that, cut off and replaced. There's no reason for us to believe that when the Borg surgically modify you, they do it with anesthesia. The smallest detail in the world, but still, Picard would be unbelievably traumatized by all of that, not to mention the fact that it's made abundantly clear in his subsequent episodes and movies that his connection with the Borg has not changed. It's still there. They're still able to co-opt him, in other words. They don't quite do it, but they're able to. And so on and so forth. The ramifications of Data, a sentient android super being, content to work his way up through the ranks of Starfleet, never examined. Never. Not anywhere near as fully as it should be. One of the opening inciting tragedies of Star Trek Picard involves Data-style androids running amok. And the Data is explored in subsequent episodes, in subsequent series of the show, and even given an evil double. But that goes nowhere. My point being that just as Starfleet would not under any circumstances tell Jean-Luc Picard, they wouldn't say to him, we're really happy that you survived, we're really happy that you are not a part of the collective anymore, but of course you're not serving in Starfleet, you don't get any command codes, you're certainly not going to be the captain of the Enterprise anymore. I'm afraid not. You can stay on the grounds of Starfleet and we'll study you, but you don't get to go back in the field. It's not just that, it's also Starfleet saying to Cadet Data, well, okay, we might study you here at Starfleet, but we're not going to let you become a serving member on a starship whose hull you can break open with your hands. No, we're not going to do that. And the same thing with Worf. Well, okay, Starfleet would say, we're very happy that you've integrated. We're proud of your human parents for raising you. But we're, of course, not going to let Klingon in Starfleet. We know that you have a turbulent family history in the Empire. No idea the long-term ramifications of that. No idea whatsoever if you're trustworthy to be in Starfleet. Same thing with Counselor Troy. Or telepathic or empathic, or however you want to say it, crew members of any kind. I had those same objections before Star Trek The Next Generation even aired with Lieutenant Ilea in Star Trek The Motion Picture, who we're told is a Deltan, and she says that she would never take advantage of a sexually immature species. But she has. She had a sexual relationship with Will Decker, and is she the only Deltan in Starfleet? Oh, she says, my oath of celibacy is on record. An oath of celibacy is just words. So you have the ultimate sexual predators just roaming around on starships with access to the engineering section? No, I don't think so. And so on and so forth. Those are older things, but The Next Generation is crammed full of those things. Crammed full. I asked the question in an earlier Next Generation video, which is just me railing against my old objections to the show. I asked the question earlier, why aren't all Starfleet engineers required to have the same visor that Geordi LaForge has? He can detect microscopic fissures in warp casings, in plasma conduits. He can look at them and see those things that you'd otherwise need instruments to be able to detect. Why don't all Starfleet engineers have that? I'm not saying that Starfleet would require them to cut out their eyes, but surely that's something that you could make on a pair of glasses. Why don't Starfleet engineers, if that technology exists, why is it only Geordi who has it? And so on and so forth, all the way down the line. All the way down. It's not just Picard taking command of the Enterprise again after he had been assimilated by the Borg. It's also him taking command of the Enterprise again after he had been tortured and traumatized by Cardassian. In the real world, those things don't happen. And the thing that I liked about The Next Generation is how much it was trying to get away from, it didn't always succeed, but it was trying to get away from the outre weirdness of the original series, where the Enterprise could meet the god Apollo, or meet witches and warlocks and whatnot. They were trying to get away from that and have something a little more like a settled, in-continuity realism. Except for all of these things that kept happening. That would not happen. That would not happen twice. Certainly they would not happen twice. But I learned to roll with that. Fans of the show have told me, okay, well, you grant a huge amount of leeway to the original show. Grant the same amount of leeway to The Next Generation, especially this September for BookTrek, and see if you don't like it more. And they were right. They were absolutely right. Once I did that, once I granted The Next Generation the same amount of I don't think so leeway that I granted to the original show, suddenly I saw it. Suddenly I saw it completely clear. It was all I wanted. I knew that I wasn't seeing it clearly. I knew that 40 million Frenchmen can't be wrong. I knew that all of the Next Generation fans that I have known over the decades couldn't all be wrong about this thing. I know. I told myself for a long time, well, they're not wrong about it, but they're not objective either, because they were basically raised by this show. I know so many people in their late 30s, early 40s, even 50s, who got huge amounts of their personal makeup from the examples of this show. And kudos to the show for taking that responsibility seriously. Kudos to the show for that. A kind of restless, literally sleepless curiosity about the world from Data. A nonstop sense of compassion from Counselor Troy. I mock the fact that there's a counselor on board the bridge of the Enterprise. I mock how useless she is with her telepathic powers. How an enemy vessel will be firing on the Enterprise for 15 minutes with everybody rocking in their seats, and then she'll say, "I sense hostility." I mock that sort of thing. But she never embitters. She is doggedly compassionate, no matter what. And she's right there amidst all these other figures who aren't always doggedly compassionate. A lot of Next Generation fans, they imbibe that, they absorb that from her. Caustic humor from Worf, and a million other things. And especially moral rectitude, a sense of moral right and wrong from Jean-Luc Picard, who will not do anything wrong, no matter what. Which kind of makes it a little bit bittersweet, as I mentioned, that he spent so much of the first season of Star Trek Picard apologizing. But one of one of those things that bugged me about The Next Generation, I mentioned this last time, is the character of Guinan, who is an immortal bartender in the bar on the Enterprise. Because the Enterprise D, keep in mind, has 1,000 people on board. Great number of whom are not crew members. They're family and children. They're not crew members. They just live on board the Enterprise. It has a huge number of scientific labs and whatnot. It's a floating city, which I guess was the original showrunner's idea of a justification for having the counselor up on the bridge. But in addition to that, we get there's a bar on the Enterprise. I'm assuming it's not the only one. And the bartender is Guinan, and she is an old personal friend of Jean-Luc Picard. I guess she's on the Enterprise because of him. She's not part of Starfleet. Maybe he asked her to be on the Enterprise to run 10 forward and give him counsel. She seems to have mystical abilities, extrasensory abilities that go far beyond anything that Deanna Troi has. And they're inconsistent, and they're never explained. Other members of her species don't appear to have them. And she is able to dictate starship policy based on these weird, unexplained intuitions. How many times in the original series, in The Next Generation, is Picard forced to say, "I've come to trust her intuition," to some character who is basically wondering, who the hell is this? Why are we doing any of this? Why are you listening to this person? I understand the showrunners knew that Whoopi Goldberg was interested. Whoopi Goldberg is a huge talent. If she's interested in being on your TV show of Star Trek, you do what you can. I imagine they thought up all sorts of wild ideas, and that this one was one that they could use. It still had to be incredibly impressive and unaccountable to everyone else. But I don't think it helps. I know I'm biased, but I much prefer my idea of her being an occasionally visiting Commodore, who outranks Jean-Luc Picard and who can occasionally take command of the Enterprise. Not in a vindictive way, not in the way that Star Trek always gives us, where if the superior officer takes command of the Enterprise, they're the bad guy. Jellicoe. Not that, but just the way Starfleet would function. The occasion, if there's an emergency, Commodore plants her flag on the flagship and takes over the fleet. I would much have preferred that to the weird X factor that is Guinan, especially when we learn gradually that there is a connection between Guinan and the Borg, that there's some sort of past connection between Guinan and Q. None of it is really explained. None of it is really accountable from one episode to the next, but it spills over into the novels, especially the novelist that I am reading these days, and that is Peter David. I would say probably fair to say the most popular Star Trek The Next Generation novelist, and one that Next Generation fans have always recommended to me. They've always said, oh, well, no matter what you do, you got to read Peter David's big Star Trek novels. He wrote, I think, 3 of them. 4 of them, maybe. The big, extra long Star Trek The Next Generation novels. And so I read his Q novel, and I didn't particularly like it. I didn't particularly like it. Then I read his romance novel, Imzadi, and I didn't particularly like it. This is a comic book author. And I always thought that it really shows that he is basically writing panel by panel and wanting to make sure you turn the page, which is not how you write a novel. Anyway, I said that I would read some of his novels for BookTrek, and I got flooded with emails from a lot of you Next Generation fans. I'm having a blast having all of you write to me. Don't think I'm complaining about that at all. I got flooded with emails from Next Gen fans telling me that I should read this book, Vendetta, by Peter David. A giant novel that explicitly connects the history of Guinan's people and the Borg, and also the original show. A thing that's not on this cover but really should be is the giant doomsday weapon from the original series. That starred Commodore Decker, Will Decker's father. In that show, the Doomsday Machine, we are told that this gigantic thing, this planet-killing device, came from outside the galaxy, and that it must have been a doomsday weapon of some kind or other. Maybe there was more than one, and it had gone rogue, or its operators had long since died off. No explanation is ever given for what that weapon is, or whoever invented it, or where it comes from. Kirk and his crew barely, by the skin of their teeth, figure out a way to deactivate the thing. But no explanation is ever given, and this book provides an explanation of what that device was and where it comes from. And shows us another example of that kind of technology, only this one is under direct control by a madwoman intent on revenge against the Borg. And TNG fans were telling me, okay, you might not have liked Imzadi. I didn't really like it either. The alternate timeline type stuff might not appeal to everybody. And you might not have liked Q Squared, but you'll love Vendetta. Now, I read Vendetta back in 2000, 2001, whenever this thing came out. I read it when it came out. I bought it and read it. And I thought it was incredibly gripping. It is incredibly gripping. It's incredibly page-turning. But that having been said, now that I have reread it, I am done with this author. And I have long since sworn off reading any of his comics back in the 90s or the early aughts. If I learned that I was reading a comic and they announced that he was going to take over the writing chores, I would go to my LCS, my local comic shop, and tell them, okay, when he takes over the comic, I don't want it anymore on my pull list. So, make the appropriate adjustment. And I realize that now, no disrespect intended to any of you TNG fans that love this guy, but I realize I have to make the same decision now about his novels. They're just not for me. I can tell you objectively, quite a little bit of furor going around in our little corner of BookTube about whether or not reviews can be objective. I can plan on a video or a fusillade of videos from me on that subject, but that's not BookTrek. Objectively speaking, there are all sorts of problems with this. It's a giant novel, as it says right on the cover. Peter David got a brief for a much longer word count than usual, and it shows. This thing is stretched. This is a 220-page novel that's stretched to twice that length. It shows. There are long, dry spells where people just bat verbiage back and forth, where they just blather at each other in a way that I guess would look kind of snappy if it was in word balloons on a 9-panel page of a comic book, but in a novel, it's maddening, especially since none of the characters talk like they're themselves, like they are on the show. This novel takes place immediately after Picard is rescued from the Borg. I know that period of the show. I watched it carefully when it was first premiered, and I have been rewatching it. There's no good characterization anywhere near here. This book is entirely about Peter David. just vamping for the audience. Just, I'm going to give you one thrill after another. I'm going to detach a Borg from the collective. He does it ahead of I, Borg, the Next Generation episode that introduces Hugh, but it's far less well done. And the real his conception of the Borg, it isn't just that he's inventing details that are outside of canon. It's that he's inventing details that are contrary to canon. It's not like Star Trek: The Next Generation fans knew nothing about the Borg before this book came out. I think this was the first time the Borg ever appeared in a novel. But who cares if it's this poorly done? I shouldn't say poorly done on every level, because if these characters weren't supposed to be anybody else's creative property, if they were just Peter David's property, then I would count this book as a stellar success, especially the whopper 60 pages at the end. It's just got, I mean, anybody who's ever read this book will tell you the same thing. And I would have been my impression if you talked to me 20 years ago and I said, well, I'm not so sure about the rest of it, but there seem to be whole chunks of it, 3, 4, 15-page chunks that are just throwaway. They're just slapstick. They're just designed to be, just to keep you, snapping your gum, and then you move on. They don't have anything to do with the plot. But the ending is incredible. The dramatic, it rises to a dramatic crescendo that really pays off. Even 20 years ago, I would have told you that, and I'd still say it. Rereading it, I appreciated that, but oh my, that was not enough. That was not enough. I don't think Peter David, I don't know if he's still alive, but if he is, I don't think he has any pretensions of writing any Star Trek anytime soon. But it doesn't matter. He's written probably 20 other Star Trek novels. I will not be getting to any of them. I will not be rereading any of them. I will not be reading for the first time any of them. I'm just going to leave this author alone. He and I know he must be a fan of Next Generation fans, but he and I don't get along. And I think the reason why, oddly enough, coming from someone who mocked this show for endlessly for decades, I think the reason why he and I don't get along, now that I've read his 3 big books, I think the reason he and I don't get along is because he doesn't take this seriously. He doesn't take this show, this incarnation of the show, seriously. And now I do. So I want these characters, there's a world of stuff that you can do with these characters in character. There's no reason for you to do this sort of thing. So that's your Star Trek book for today on BookTrek. It's Vendetta. It was the Mount Everest that all of you were asking me to climb. I did. I read it before most of you were able to walk, and then I read it again last night. And I'm going to move on completely. For tonight, I always flip at random through the Star Trek data pad and pick a book basically at random, but and I will still be random tonight, but the guide for tonight is to pick a Next Generation novel that I have not read and just go at it cold. These Peter David books just have sort of left a bad taste in my mouth. So I'm going to try and find a Next Generation novel that I absolutely haven't read and just go at it fresh. And we'll see what the result is tomorrow. I will check back in tomorrow. So I will wrap this up for now, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.